used to the cold.
Hello, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Tuesday evening, our technical Tuesday. And I know it's quite chilly out there, but thanks for gathering around this little fireplace and tuning in tonight. And for those who aren't able to make it, well, enjoy the recording. So we've been covering the largest organ of the body, namely our skin. And we're going to continue on tonight. We've done a couple of the diseases and things that can happen, and how things like burns and herpes, etc., and how skin heals, namely from the inside out. Last week we finished off with the fingernails. Well, nails in general, because fingers, toes, all of them have got nails. And tonight we'll kick off with this part, which is the hair, which still forms part of the skin. So let me share my screen. This was actually quite an involved talk to begin with. So it was a fun challenge. This. Okay, so as I said, the skin is our largest organ of the body. And now we're going to go on to the hair that covers, in some cases, large parts of the body. And obviously, some people have a lot more hair than others. Some people, like our founder, I really don't know why he doesn't have any hair, but Kendra has got a theory that she's spoken about as to why, but we won't mention that one right now. But your hair, if you take a little chunk out of the body, this is what it looks like. Obviously, on your head, these hairs are a whole lot closer together, but this little graphic over here would be almost like an indication of your arm hair or your leg hairs. So you've got, there's my cursor, there it is, the outer part of the skin. You've got these, if you take a microscopic look, you'll see there's little holes throughout the skin. You might think it's smooth, but it's not. And the hair grows in and it roots down, and it's always got a good blood supply. Every single part of the body has a blood supply, which I find quite fascinating. Now, body hair is normal and serves an important purpose. I know we tend to want to cut a lot of our body hair off, but it's there for a reason. It helps to regulate the body temperature and functions as a sensor to help detect things on the skin, such as bugs or cobwebs. So just think, you would never be able to know if you had walked into a spider web if you didn't have hair. Eyelashes help to protect the eyes from foreign objects, while hair in the nose helps filter out particulate matter. And if you've ever been in a dust storm, or where the wind's blowing like crazy and there's a lot of dust and sand and muck around there, you'll understand what the hair in your nose does. For me, the weirdest feeling of that was when we were in the States many moons ago. It was a little chilly when we were there. And on Christmas Eve, it was something like minus 24 degrees Celsius, which for those of us who think anything below 20 degrees is cold, that was a little on the extreme side. And walking outside, taking a breath of air, all the hairs in my nose froze, and it felt like I had wire netting almost in my nose. It was a nasty feeling for a couple of seconds until everything had stabilized, and then we were good to go again. Visible hair is composed of a fibrous protein called keratin. Hair you see is called the shaft. So this part over here is all, every little piece of hair that you see on your body is the shaft, with the root extending down into the dermis to the hair follicle, or the root, basically. The follicle is formed by epithelial cells, the rich source of blood provided by dermal blood vessels, and they are tiny, minute little things. Cells divide and grow in the base of the follicle, and older cells are pushed away and die. So the shaft of hair is comprised completely of dead cells. Here's a comforting thought. Shaving or cutting hair doesn't make it grow thicker, quicker, or faster, basically. So don't worry about when you're shaving your face or your legs or whatever, it's not going to come back thicker and faster. Hair grows at a set rate and then stops growing at a set rate too. There is a sebaceous gland associated with each hair follicle. Now think of the hairs on your head. How many sebaceous glands are there in your scalp? And these secrete sebum that coats the hair follicle and works its way to the skin's surface to prevent drying of the hair and acts as an antibacterial and lubricates the hair shaft. So this is what happens when people have these very harsh hair treatments. It destroys all of this sebum and other things, which is why their hair becomes very dry and brittle. There are a couple of other reasons why your hair goes dry and brittle, but treating your hair with these harsh chemicals is one of those ways. Sebum production decreases with age, explaining why older people tend to have drier skin and more brittle hair. Now, hair color is dependent on the amount and type of melanin you produce. More melanin, the darker your hair, which would probably explain why people with darker skins have darker hair. White hair occurs in the absence of melanin. Red hair is a result of hair that is melanin with iron in it, if you wanted to know. My mother always used to say her hair was rusty, which is why it was red. Flat hair shafts produce curly hair, while round hair shafts produce straight hair. This is quite mind-blowing for me, because if you look around, next time you're out and about in public, look at people's hair, because pretty much everybody's hair is different. Different colors, different styles, different lengths, different densities. Some people have very thin hair, some have very thick hair, some hair grows slowly, some hair grows fast. I find that all fascinating because it's all so carefully, specially made. Now, alopecia is a term for any type of hair loss and can be acute or chronic. So technically, people who are on chemotherapy and lose their hair are referred to as those who are suffering from alopecia. Now, this could be a result of the chemo, obviously, but also when you think of our founder, Jerry Brasfield, he has alopecia, but I don't know why, because he obviously is not on chemotherapy and he's extremely fit and healthy. Some forms, such as male pattern baldness, do not represent a disease, but are inherited traits. So that's one of the reasons for alopecia. There's a couple of quite fascinating testimonials on the Near Life North America Facebook page, where two people, there was a young child and another gentleman who's now a bit older, but when he lost his hair, first of all, I think he was about 16 or 17. And he woke up one morning and suddenly all of his hair was falling out. And the rest of his teenager time was not a very pleasant time. But thanks to good nutrition, if you look at him today, you would never, ever know. And for anybody who's interested, let me know, and I can send you a link to the interview that they did with him about what happened with his hair and how it came back again. Hair loss can also be a result of chemotherapy or cancer treatments, hormonal imbalance, scale infections, severe emotional or physical stress, or side effects of other medications. So whenever you have medication, there's always going to be side effects, and this is one of those things. So the temperature regulation, your integumentary system plays a major role in regulation of the body's temperature. So for those of us who are all covered up tonight, you know that your skin is working, but maybe not working as effectively as it should. And for those of us who are not covered up tonight, you'll understand why. Part of the regulation of temperature is accomplished by changes in size of blood vessels. So obviously my blood vessels are a little bit thicker tonight than what they would have been normally. Vasodilation exposes heated blood to external cooling air. And vasoconstriction keeps cooling of blood to a minimum when it's cold outside. So there you go. That explains how you're feeling tonight. Sweat glands excrete water onto the skin's surface, allowing cooling through evaporation. This requires adequate hydration to continue to produce sweat. And this is where the problem comes in extreme heat conditions. Think January, February, athletes running around, and they're not drinking sufficient fluid, and they end up with heat stroke or heat exhaustion. Jenny would be able to explain a little bit more about that and the signs and symptoms, but basically if you become dehydrated and your sweat quits when it's hot, your sweat glands stop excreting the sweat, you end up with a problem. By the time that you feel thirsty, you're already dehydrating, and you can potentially secrete 12 liters of sweat in a 24-hour period. Think of the guys who are doing the Comrades Marathon on Sunday. If it's relatively warm and they're not hydrating enough, they are going to end up with problems before they get to the end of their race. Now, shivering causes muscle activity that produces heat to warm you when you're cold. So imagine you're sitting there and it's cold outside. Now, you don't have a jersey or a jacket or anything. You're simply sitting there with just your bare arms and you don't shiver. You could potentially die from cold. And this is what happens when people are caught in snow and frost areas and their body gets to the stage where the core temperature starts cooling down and they quit shivering. That is when the danger period kicks in. Because when you shiver, obviously there's an activation of the muscles, which then produce the heat to warm you up. And then the hairs on the skin stand erect when the arrector pili muscles contract. This is known as goosebumps. And these hairs create dead space that insulate you from cooler surroundings, almost like your own built-in goose down jacket. Is our body not an amazing design? Now, there's some diseases of the skin as well. First of all, we know one of the things we know most commonly is acne. And this is a metabolic condition with also caused by allergies, various drugs, or endocrine disorders that are possible causes as well. The signs and symptoms include inflammation of the hair follicles or the sebaceous glands, especially on the face, the neck, the chest, and the upper back and shoulders. And they can form blackheads, cysts, nodules, pustules, and pimples. And if you haven't experienced this yourself during teenagehood, I think probably we all know of teenagers somewhere along the line who have suffered from acne. And in some cases, there are people around still today who, while they no longer suffer from acne, you can see the scars on their face as a result. And all it takes is a visual examination to diagnose this. And treatments for a mild case, just proper cleansing techniques and over-the-counter treatments. We've got a very good skincare range that helps tremendously with this. A severe case requires proper cleansing techniques, including prescribed medications, antibiotics, steroids, and or all-trans-retinoic acid. This is now really extreme cases, and I would suggest that you work very carefully with somebody who knows exactly what they're doing. The next problem that we have is a boil or furuncle. And I know one of my sisters, every time that she cut a tooth back in her younger days, she ended up with a boil. Fortunately, I wasn't around at that time, but I remember the stories of this, where she had boils for every tooth that she was cutting. And this is caused by a Staphylococcus bacteria. And the signs and symptoms include inflammation, localized encapsulated pus-filled lesion. It's extremely painful at the affected site, and the carbuncles are a large abscess composed of several furuncles, these little things all the way around there. And it is not a pleasant thing to experience because it hurts. And you can see this from a visual examination, or if they take a sample or a culture from the boil, they can figure out what's causing the problem as well. You treat it through proper antiseptic cleansing, antibiotics, application of warm, moist heat, like a warm face cloth, and depending on the severity, it may require draining, and that needs to be done by a suitably qualified person. Do not do it yourself. The next thing that we have is burns, and this, for me, has to be one of the worst injuries ever. And it's going to be caused by heat or radiation of varying intensities and duration. So obviously heat, flame, candle, sun, any of those sort of things, stovetop, heaters, all of those can cause that. And depending on the intensity and duration, the signs and symptoms include reddening of the affected surface, penetrating additional skin layers as severity increases. And the color is dependent on the severity with a deepening red to black. I did cover this in one of my earlier sessions in the same series. Obviously, it just needs a visual examination to determine, and the treatment is dependent upon sort of the severity. And if there's a blister, please never, under any circumstances, pop it on purpose. That needs to be done again under suitable conditions and by a trained person. Cellulitis is something that I see on a fairly regular basis in hospital, and it's not exactly cellulite that we are all familiar with, but cellulitis, remember what itis means? Itis means inflammation. So it's an inflammation of the cellulite, which is just below the skin. Again, caused by a bacteria, either Streptococcus and or Staphylococcus. And there's inflammation of the skin and the subcutaneous, meaning just below the skin tissue. It becomes red, swollen, and extremely painful. And when people come into hospital, they are not happy campers. And this can flare sometimes incredibly fast. You can see it through a visual examination, as well as taking a swab and doing a site culture. The treatment that is generally done in a bad case, which is the ones that I see in hospital, they're there, and they normally spend at least 5 days in hospital on an intravenous drip with extremely potent antibiotics, which work generally pretty effectively. Oral ones in the early stages work well. If it gets that bad, the intravenous ones work much, much better. A contusion or bruise. This is something that probably most of us are familiar with if we've ever tried to move a wall or door or furniture with our legs or arms. You end up with a bruise. It's caused by blunt force or some form of skin injury without the skin surface breaking. And technically what a bruise is bleeding beneath the surface of the skin. Obviously, dependent on what you've tried to move, you will have pain, swelling, and or discoloration. So this happens when you roll your ankle as well. You will end up with that pain, the swelling, the discoloration, and you can see quite often, I can tell almost exactly which ligaments are involved after somebody's sprained their ankle by simply following the bruise line down. And it becomes quite an interesting color after a while. You check it out, obviously, through visual inspection, and imaging may be needed to check for more severe injuries. So sometimes, like for instance, a very bad car accident where you see the skin extremely purple, they will do an ultrasound over there to see how deep that goes and how bad it is beneath the skin. Some of the treatments include cold applications, bag of frozen peas or corn wrapped in a towel, not directly on the skin. Firm bandage to impede swelling, elevation when possible, heat application, I wouldn't do that in the early stages, and massage, again, not in the early stages, but maybe later on. And just as an aside over there, I have found that if we take a mixture of Care, which is our disinfectant, diluted about maybe 1 to 20, and you put that onto a face cloth or something like that and apply that to the bruise area as a cold compress, that tends to help quite a bit by reducing the bruising and the swelling. Dermatitis is another nasty thing, and this is something that I've had and still continue to have from time to time. One of them, there's a couple of different types of it, and again, remember the itis it's an inflammation of the dermis. And this can come about as a contact with an allergen, and there's an extreme range of potential agents, including soaps, cosmetics, metals, drugs, plastics, etc. What triggers mine is usually chemicals like glue and thinners and some of the rubbers that I have to use. There's different types of rubber that we use in my profession, and sometimes those can trigger it, more specifically when it's hot and very humid, especially on the coast. And if I'm stressed and have to use some of the really strong soaps that the hospitals insist that we use, that can often cause a flare-up in my dermatitis. And you'll see when you look at it, it's got small little reddish lesions to larger vesicles. So they can be very, very small little bumps to quite larger, almost like blisters that are weepy and crusted areas, and quite often can be quite itchy and irritating. And obviously you just look at it, check it out, and you'll be able to see from visual examination. So this treatment, obviously, stay away from the cause. Not always possible, but if possible, do so. And you can use medication to decrease the inflammatory process, and quite often they use cortisone for that. Eczema is slightly different to dermatitis, and there's a genetic predisposition to allergies. In infants, it may include a reaction to milk or dairy products or other foods, as well as stress. My niece had an extremely bad case of eczema in her younger days because she's allergic to a whole shopping list of things, including dairy and wheat and soya and grass and heaven knows what, and eggs. And my youngest daughter, Erin, also in her early days had an allergy to certain foods. And in some of her photos when she was about just a little bit less than a year old, her whole face was this bright red, bumpy thing because of a food allergy. Fortunately, we were able to find out what it was and sort it out pretty quickly, and she's thankfully grown out of that. So you'll see skin inflammation, which is, when you look at it, it is different to the dermatitis. Redness again, vesicles, scales, crusting, and pustules. And obviously you check it out visually and check out the history, so the clinical history. There is no true cure for either dermatitis or eczema, but you can treat the symptoms by eliminating the offending food, reducing stress, using topical corticosteroid creams, skin moisturizers, and antihistamines. Personally, what I use is I found our personal care concentrate, or PCC, works extremely well, and my hands never flare up and often calm down. If they are very, very red and itchy and irritating, I'll wash them as often as I can with the PCC, both at work and at home, and that pretty quickly stops that flare up from happening. and sorts it out, makes me feel a lot more comfortable. And then I apply aloe gel, which is what works for me. And then obviously also our skincare range. Those products are all very soothing. Eczema continued, the genetic predisposition to allergies. In infants, it may include a reaction to milk or dairy. Oops, carried on with that. So there's different types of that. The next thing is hives, otherwise known as urticaria. I'd never heard that word before until I developed an outbreak one day because of a bug, and that's what was diagnosed. It's an allergic reaction to an external agent such as bee stings, plants, temperature extremes, sunlight, or internal agents such as food additives, medication, antibiotics, or specific disease conditions. So this would need to be diagnosed by a suitably qualified doctor. And you see it looks like itchy wheals that are surrounded by a red inflamed area, and it can cover most of the body. And it's an extreme itch and it's not fun. Again, check visually and take the patient's history into account. Be treated with antihistamines and obviously avoid the allergen. And I'm going to stop right there. We've got about 5 minutes left, and I'll get into skin and skin care or skincare products next week. Does anybody have any questions or comments before I stop this recording?